Hi, all. My name is Paige Wiley. I'm the co-author of Worked Up, Navigating Calling After College. And today we're talking through the myth that there's only one right career path out there for me. Now, I think we often equate finding a job, major, or career to finding a soulmate. I think we want to believe that there's only one right option out there for us, and everything outside of that option is somehow deviating from the path. Now, while I believe that there's room for romanticism and imagination within the Christian world, I think this way of looking at work distorts it a little bit. I like to think of this as the bullseye distortion, this idea that we were only made for one thing in this world, and if we're not hitting that target with this bullseye-like accuracy, that we're somehow missing the mark, that we're outside of God's will or God's path for our lives. If that's true, that means that the stakes are pretty high, right? That leaves a lot of pressure and room for doubt and anxiety if we feel like we've strayed from that path. I know this because I've lived it. I've been there and I've believed that. When I was in college, I felt like I was constantly asking God what He wanted me to do with my life. I said I would go anywhere and do anything, but I just wanted Him to tell me. I just wanted to know from Him what I was supposed to do. Looking back on that experience, I think part of my heart was in the right place, that I wanted to do His will. I wanted to have that Moses-like burning bush moment where I was told exactly where to go and accomplish His will. But I think some of it too was just anxiety about getting it wrong. I didn't want to make the decision because I didn't want to make a wrong move. I didn't want to fail. What would it look like to reimagine calling? To not believe that we only had one straight shot linear path in our lives, but that perhaps a calling could look like something else. I like the way that Oskinus talks about calling. He talks about that we have primary and secondary callings. Our primary calling is this call to the Lord, that we were called out of our sinful nature through the reconciliation of Jesus on the cross to a perfect union with God. This is our first and foremost, most important call. It's the call to be followers and disciples of Him. Our primary call then informs our secondary callings. So those secondary callings are callings to our environments, work, relationships, families, communities. These are all good things too, right? They're just not our primary call. The thing I love about this framework is that it shows us that if our primary call is to God, and God made all people, all places, all good workplaces, then that means that there's not just one right option, right? Our secondary callings could look vast and explorative, that we could see that there is not just one straight shot linear path for us, but that if He is in all things and made all things, then there are a lot of paths that are good. There's an activity in Worked Up called the Wandering Map, and it's this exercise where you get a blank sheet of paper and you just write out every job and experience and hobby you've ever done. And you write it all out. It looks like a mess because it is. And then you start making connections. And you connect one job to the next. You see threads between activities or interests that you have. And you start reimagining what a calling looks like. Maybe it's non-linear, and maybe you've taken some turns along the way. But when you start seeing those connections, you see that maybe calling could look different. When I did this activity for myself, it helped me to reshape what I thought about calling. It showed me that at 16, I was called to be a tutor in my first job. And then at 19, I was called to be a camp counselor. And then at 22, I was called to work at a career center. And those things weren't independent of each other. They were actually connected. And each calling in one season informed the next. And it was just my job to be faithful to that call in each season and each place. That it wasn't stops along the way to this ultimate calling and ultimate goal. Part of it was just being faithful to that season and call. I like to think about Matthew 6:33 when we talk about calling, which says to seek first His kingdom and righteousness, and all these other things will be given to you. I love this verse because I think it points to that primary call. We're called first and foremost to His kingdom, His righteousness, to God Himself. And then in doing so, we surrender the rest of our lives, our secondary callings. When I think back to my story, and if God had told me exactly what He had planned for my life or what He wanted me to do, I don't know if I would have included Him as much. I don't know if I would have had to learn the practice of surrender and surrendering each day and each week and each season to him. That it was almost an act of grace to not know and to have to come back and surrender my life in a daily manner. I'll last leave you with Romans 8:28, which says that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him and who've been called according to his purpose. I love this because I think it gives us freedom as Christians to believe that even in our successes and our mistakes, that God is still working all things for good. That we don't have to get it right. We don't have to get the exact right major or exact right career path, but that he is working things for our good. I love thinking about the story of Joseph and how his path looked really nonlinear. How he went from being a shepherd to a slave, from a servant to a prisoner, to the second in command of Egypt. I wonder if at some point he questioned whether God was leading him, whether he had taken a wrong turn, if God had even abandoned him in the calling that he felt like he had. Maybe that God had even left him and not led him to where he needed to go. But what I love about that verse in Romans is that it teaches us that God works all things for good. That Joseph didn't have to worry about where he was going or what he was doing because God was leading. And it was Joseph's job then just to be faithful in each season and each calling. What would it look like for us to do the same?